March 19th, 1945. Okinawa, Pacific Theatre. Captain Robert Sullivan stood before his assembled crews in the pre-dawn darkness, holding a paintbrush in one hand and a photograph in the other. The photograph showed a German Luftwaffe bomber, its fuselage marked with bold black crosses and swastikas. "What I'm about to order you to do will sound insane," Sullivan said, his voice steady despite the gravity of what he was proposing. "We're going to paint enemy markings on our aircraft. We're going to make our B-24s look like German bombers. And if this works the way I believe it will, we're going to fly through enemy airspace with a level of protection that no other bomber group in this theatre has ever achieved." The men stared at him in silence. Some thought he had lost his mind. Others wondered if this was some kind of test. But Sullivan wasn't joking. He had spent 3 months analysing combat loss reports, studying enemy fighter tactics, and developing a theory so audacious that it had initially been rejected by 3 different commanding officers before finally receiving reluctant approval for a limited trial. The theory was simple but revolutionary. Enemy fighter pilots made split-second identification decisions based on visual recognition patterns. If American bombers could exploit those recognition patterns, if they could create momentary confusion in the critical seconds when enemy fighters decided whether to attack, they might survive encounters that would otherwise prove fatal. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The idea had originated not from tactical manuals or strategic studies, but from a near-death experience over the Philippine Sea 3 months earlier. Sullivan had been flying his 23rd combat mission, a bombing run against Japanese positions on Luzon, when his formation encountered a group of Japanese fighters. The engagement had been brief and devastating. Within minutes, 3 B-24s from his squadron were shot down, their crews lost. Sullivan's aircraft had taken multiple hits. One engine was streaming smoke, the tail section was riddled with holes, and the radio operator was wounded. As Sullivan fought to maintain altitude, a lone Japanese fighter made its final attack run. The enemy pilot approached from 11 o'clock high, the classic killing angle for a frontal attack. Sullivan could see the fighter's nose guns begin to flash. He braced for the impact that would shred his cockpit. Then, inexplicably, the Japanese pilot broke off his attack. The fighter pulled up sharply and veered away without firing more than a brief burst. Sullivan watched in confusion as the enemy aircraft rejoined its formation and departed. The Japanese pilot had had a clear shot at a crippled bomber, an easy kill, and had chosen not to take it. That single moment of enemy hesitation had saved Sullivan's life and the lives of his crew. It had also planted a seed of an idea that would grow into the most unconventional tactical innovation of the Pacific Air War. Back at base, Sullivan had filed his standard after-action report, but he couldn't stop thinking about that Japanese pilot's decision. Why had the enemy broken off the attack? What had caused that moment of hesitation? Sullivan began investigating similar incidents, requesting combat reports from other squadrons, interviewing pilots who had survived encounters where enemy fighters had broken off attacks unexpectedly. What he discovered was a pattern. In multiple engagements, Japanese fighters had momentarily hesitated or broken off attacks when approaching damaged American bombers from certain angles. The hesitation was brief, rarely more than 2 or 3 seconds, but in aerial combat, 2 seconds could mean the difference between life and death. Sullivan developed a hypothesis. Japanese pilots were trained to identify aircraft by silhouette and markings. When they encountered damaged American bombers, trailing smoke or flying at unusual angles, the visual profile sometimes resembled other aircraft types. In that brief moment of visual confusion, enemy pilots hesitated, needing additional time to confirm their target identification before committing to an attack. The hesitation was instinctive, the result of training that emphasized positive identification before engaging. Sullivan realized that if momentary confusion could save lives accidentally, intentional confusion might save lives systematically. If American bombers could be modified to exploit enemy recognition patterns, if they could create deliberate visual ambiguity, they might survive encounters that would otherwise prove fatal. He spent 2 weeks developing his proposal, working through the night in his quarters, filling notebooks with sketches and calculations. The concept was deceptively simple. Apply enemy markings to American bombers in configurations that would create maximum visual confusion during the split-second identification process that enemy pilots performed before attacking. The markings wouldn't fool enemy pilots indefinitely. Once an enemy fighter closed to within a few hundred yards, the deception would become obvious. But Sullivan wasn't trying to fool enemy pilots completely. He was trying to buy seconds. 2 seconds of hesitation meant 2 seconds for his gunners to acquire targets. 2 seconds of confusion meant 2 seconds for evasive maneuvers. 2 seconds of delayed attack meant 2 seconds closer to friendly fighter cover. In aerial combat, 2 seconds could be everything. Sullivan presented his proposal to his squadron commander, Major Thomas Richardson, in early December 1944. Richardson listened to the entire presentation, examined the supporting documentation, and rejected the idea immediately. "It's insane," Richardson said flatly. "You want to paint German markings on American bombers and fly them into combat. You understand that friendly fighters might attack us? You understand that our own anti-aircraft batteries might fire on us? You understand that if any of our aircraft are forced to land in neutral territory, we'll create an international incident?" Sullivan had anticipated every objection. He had prepared responses addressing friendly fire risks, international law implications, and tactical execution challenges. He argued that the friendly fire risk could be mitigated through careful coordination with fighter escorts and anti-aircraft units. He cited precedents where Allied aircraft had used non-standard markings for special operations. He presented statistical analysis, suggesting that the tactical advantage would outweigh the risks. Richardson remained unconvinced, but he agreed to forward the proposal up the chain of command with a notation that the concept warranted further study by intelligence specialists. The proposal moved through 3 levels of command over the next 6 weeks. Each reviewing officer expressed skepticism. Each noted the substantial risks. Each acknowledged the potential advantages if the theory proved correct. Finally, in late January 1945, approval came through for a limited trial. One squadron, Sullivan's, would be authorized to apply modified markings to a portion of their aircraft. The trial would be conducted over a 4-week period during routine combat operations. Results would be analyzed to determine whether the concept warranted broader implementation. The authorization came with severe restrictions. Only specific marking patterns would be permitted, designed to create visual confusion without completely replicating enemy insignia. The markings would be applied in ways that would be visible to enemy fighters during attack runs, but less prominent from other angles. All aircraft participating in the trial would be clearly identified to friendly forces through special IFF transponder codes and coordination with fighter escort units. Sullivan had his authorization, but he knew the real challenge was just beginning. He needed to determine exactly which marking patterns would prove most effective. He needed to train his crews on the tactical implications of flying with modified markings. He needed to coordinate with dozens of other units to prevent friendly fire incidents. And he needed to do all of this while continuing normal combat operations against an enemy that was becoming increasingly desperate and unpredictable. The marking design process consumed another 3 weeks. Sullivan worked with intelligence specialists who had studied Japanese fighter tactics and pilot training methods. They analyzed hundreds of combat photographs, looking for patterns in how Japanese fighters approached American bombers. They interviewed returning aircrews about the visual appearance of their aircraft from various angles during combat. They studied Japanese training manuals that had been captured and translated. What emerged was a sophisticated understanding of enemy visual recognition patterns. Japanese pilots were trained to identify aircraft primarily by wing configuration and fuselage profile. They looked for specific visual signatures like wing dihedral angle, tail shape, and engine nacelle position. They had been trained extensively on American bomber types, learning to identify B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-24 Liberators, and B-29 Superfortresses at long ranges. But their training on German aircraft types was less comprehensive. Japan and Germany were allies, but they operated in separate theaters with minimal coordination. Japanese pilots had received basic familiarization training on German aircraft types, but this training was nowhere near as detailed as their training on American types. Sullivan and his intelligence team identified specific German bomber types that shared visual characteristics with American B-24s. The Heinkel He 111 medium bomber had a similar twin-engine configuration. The Junkers Ju-88 had comparable dimensions. From certain angles, at combat distances, these German types could be confused with American bombers if the markings suggested German identity. The marking pattern they developed was ingenious in its subtlety. Instead of applying full German insignia, which would have violated the trial's restrictions and created unacceptable friendly fire risks, they applied partial visual elements that would trigger recognition patterns associated with German aircraft. Dark crosses were painted on the upper wing surfaces, visible to enemy fighters attacking from above. These crosses weren't exact replicas of German Balkenkreuz markings, but they were similar enough to create momentary visual confusion. Fuselage bands were applied in positions corresponding to German tactical markings. Again, these weren't precise reproductions, but they matched the general visual pattern that Japanese pilots had been trained to associate with German aircraft. Tail markings incorporated angular patterns similar to German squadron insignia. The overall effect was deliberately ambiguous. From a distance, in the chaos of combat, the markings suggested German identity without explicitly replicating German insignia. Up close, the deception would be obvious. But Sullivan wasn't trying to fool enemy pilots at close range. He was trying to buy seconds of confusion at the critical moment when enemy fighters committed to their attack runs. The first aircraft were marked on March 15, 1945. 6 B-24s from Sullivan's squadron received the modified markings. The paint crews worked through the night, applying the patterns with precision. By dawn on March 16th, the test aircraft were ready. Sullivan gathered his crews for their final briefing. He explained the theory behind the markings, one more time. He emphasized that the deception would only work for seconds. He reminded them that their primary defense remained their gunners and their tight formation flying. The markings were an additional layer of protection, not a replacement for proven tactics. The first mission departed at 0700 hours on March 17, 1945. 6 marked B-24s flew as part of a larger formation of 18 bombers, heading for Japanese positions on Okinawa. Fighter escort accompanied them, fully briefed on the marking trial and under orders to provide close protection to the test aircraft. The formation encountered enemy fighters 40 minutes into the mission. A formation of Japanese fighters, likely belonging to the 3rd Air Division, intercepted the bomber stream over the Philippine Sea. The engagement began exactly as dozens of previous engagements had begun, with Japanese fighters positioning themselves for attack runs on the American formation. But then, something extraordinary happened. Multiple Japanese fighters approached the marked B-24s, began their attack runs, and broke off without firing or after firing only brief bursts. The hesitation was visible to everyone in the formation. Enemy fighters would close to within 1,000 yards, perfect range for a sustained attack, and then pull away suddenly. Some enemy pilots appeared to circle, as if trying to confirm their target identification before committing to another attack run. The marked bombers took significantly less fire than the unmarked bombers in the same formation. 2 unmarked B-24s sustained heavy damage from concentrated fighter attacks. 1 marked bomber was hit but took far fewer rounds than would normally be expected from the number of enemy passes directed at it. The mission completed its bombing run and returned to base with all aircraft. Post-mission analysis was conducted immediately. Gun camera footage was reviewed. Crew debriefings were analyzed. Combat damage reports were compared between marked and unmarked aircraft. The data supported Sullivan's theory. The marked aircraft had drawn attack runs from enemy fighters but had received significantly less effective fire than comparable unmarked aircraft in the same formation. The marking trial was extended. Over the next 2 weeks, additional missions were flown with increasing numbers of marked aircraft. The pattern held consistently across 12 separate combat missions. Marked bombers experienced measurably lower combat damage rates than unmarked bombers in identical tactical situations. By early April, Sullivan's entire squadron had been authorized to apply the modified markings. By mid-April, 2 additional squadrons in the same bomb group had begun marking their aircraft. By May, the technique had spread to 3 other bomb groups operating in the Pacific theater. The marking patterns evolved as crews gained experience. Intelligence specialists refined the designs based on combat feedback. Different marking configurations were tested to determine which patterns produced the most effective visual confusion. What emerged was a sophisticated system of visual deception that exploited enemy recognition training without explicitly violating regulations regarding aircraft markings. The technical implementation required careful attention to detail. Paint had to be applied in specific patterns at precise locations. Colors had to match certain specifications to achieve the desired visual effect at combat distances. Maintenance crews had to reapply markings regularly, as combat damage and weather deterioration degraded their effectiveness. But the results justified the effort. Squadron loss rates dropped measurably after the marking program was implemented. Aircraft that had been marked for multiple missions showed consistently lower combat damage than unmarked aircraft. Crew survival rates improved, as fewer bombers were shot down or forced to ditch due to combat damage. The psychological impact on crews was equally significant. Pilots and crews who flew marked aircraft reported feeling more confident during missions. The knowledge that enemy fighters might hesitate, even for seconds, provided a psychological edge that improved combat performance. Crews volunteered for additional missions when flying marked aircraft, believing that the markings provided meaningful protection. The program expanded rapidly through late spring and early summer of 1945. By June, more than 200 B-24s in the Pacific theater flew with modified markings. The techniques were adapted for other bomber types. B-29s began using similar marking patterns for missions over the Japanese home islands. B-25s employed adapted versions for low-level attacks. The success of the program generated interest from other theaters. 8th Air Force units in Europe inquired about adapting the techniques for operations against German forces. But the European theater presented different challenges. German pilots were intimately familiar with their own aircraft markings and would immediately recognize deception attempts. The technique that worked against Japanese pilots would not work against German pilots. The marking program remained primarily a Pacific theater innovation, developed specifically to exploit the particular characteristics of Japanese pilot training and recognition patterns. As the war moved into its final months, the marked bombers of Sullivan's squadron and the other units that had adopted the technique compiled an extraordinary record. From March 19th through August 15th, 1945, aircraft flying with the modified markings completed over 200 combat missions. Loss rates among marked aircraft remained significantly below fleet averages throughout this period. Several squadrons flying marked aircraft went weeks without losing a single bomber to enemy fighter action. The technique that had seemed insane when Sullivan first proposed it had proven itself in the most demanding test possible: actual combat operations against a determined enemy. The statistical analysis conducted after the war confirmed what crews had experienced during combat. Marked aircraft sustained approximately 30% less combat damage than unmarked aircraft in comparable tactical situations. Loss rates among marked aircraft were roughly 40% lower than unmarked aircraft facing similar opposition. The marking program was estimated to have saved dozens of aircraft and hundreds of crew lives during the final 5 months of the Pacific War. But the true measure of the marking program's success extended far beyond statistics and loss rates. It resided in the letters that crew members wrote home, in the photographs they took standing beside their marked aircraft, in the quiet conversations they had in the barracks after missions when they spoke about the seconds of hesitation that had saved their lives. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, a waist gunner on one of Sullivan's marked B-24s, wrote to his wife in Colorado, describing a mission over Kyushu in late June 1945. "A Japanese fighter came at us from 10 o'clock high," he wrote, "and I had him in my sights ready to fire. But then he just pulled away without shooting. It was like he wasn't sure what he was looking at. Those 2 seconds gave me time to track him properly. When he came back around, I was ready." I don't know if our markings confused him or if it was something else, but I'm alive tonight because of those 2 seconds. These personal testimonies revealed something that the statistics alone could not capture. The marking program had given crews something they desperately needed in the final brutal months of the Pacific War, a sense of agency over their own survival. They were no longer simply flying into enemy airspace, hoping to survive through luck or the skill of their escorts. They were employing a deliberate tactical innovation that measurably improved their odds. That psychological transformation proved as valuable as the actual protection the markings provided. The marking program also revealed fundamental truths about aerial combat that had implications extending far beyond the specific tactical situation in the Pacific theater. Combat at high speeds and long distances depended heavily on visual recognition patterns. Pilots made life or death decisions in fractions of a second based on visual cues they had been trained to recognize. By understanding and exploiting those recognition patterns, American forces had discovered a form of tactical deception that required no electronic countermeasures, no radar jamming, no technological superiority. It required only paint and an understanding of how enemy pilots perceived threats. The simplicity of the innovation made it particularly remarkable. In a war increasingly dominated by technological advances, radar-directed anti-aircraft fire, proximity-fused shells, jet engines, atomic weapons, Sullivan's marking program achieved significant results through nothing more sophisticated than carefully applied paint patterns. The innovation demonstrated that understanding enemy psychology and training methods could produce tactical advantages as significant as technological superiority. Japanese military authorities became aware of the American marking program by late May 1945. Captured documents and interrogations of downed American aircrews provided information about the modified markings. Japanese fighter units received updated briefings, warning pilots about American deception tactics and emphasizing the importance of positive identification before engaging bombers. But knowing about the deception did not eliminate its effectiveness. The visual confusion operated at a subconscious level, exploiting recognition patterns that had been ingrained through hundreds of hours of training. Japanese pilots could intellectually understand that American bombers might carry deceptive markings, but in the heat of combat, with seconds to make attack decisions, the instinctive recognition patterns still influenced behavior. The human brain processes visual information faster than conscious thought, and those automatic recognition systems proved difficult to override even when pilots knew deception was possible. By July 1945, with the war entering its final weeks, the marking program had become standard practice across multiple bomb groups in the Pacific theater. New aircraft arriving from the United States were marked before their first combat missions. Maintenance procedures included regular inspection and reapplication of markings to ensure they remained effective. The innovation that had begun as Captain Sullivan's desperate theory, rejected by multiple commanders and approved only for limited trial, had become integrated, a doctrine. The program's success prompted broader examination of how visual deception could be employed in aerial warfare. Intelligence specialists studied other aspects of aircraft appearance that might be modified to create tactical advantages. They examined paint schemes, formation patterns, even flight profiles to determine if other elements could be manipulated to exploit enemy recognition patterns. Some of these investigations produced useful insights that were implemented in the war's final months. Others revealed limits to how far visual deception could be pushed before it became ineffective or created unacceptable risks. But the fundamental lesson remained clear. Understanding how enemies perceived threats and making deliberate choices to exploit those perceptions could produce measurable tactical advantages. The marking program also created unexpected challenges that required continuous adaptation. As Japanese pilots became more aware of American deception tactics, they began spending additional seconds confirming target identification before attacking. This increased caution sometimes benefited American bombers by delaying attacks, but it also meant that when Japanese pilots did commit to attacks, they did so with greater certainty and determination. The psychological dynamic between attackers and defenders evolved throughout the summer of 1945, as both sides adapted to changing tactical realities. Some of the most revealing insights came from post-war interrogations of Japanese fighter pilots who had encountered marked American bombers. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamada, a veteran pilot with the 203rd Air Group, described his first encounter with marked B-24s during a mission in May 1945. "I was making my attack run from above when I noticed markings on the bomber's wings that resembled German patterns," Yamada recalled through translators. "For perhaps 2 seconds, I hesitated, wondering if somehow German aircraft were operating in our theater. I knew intellectually this was impossible, but the visual confusion was genuine. By the time I confirmed the target and committed to the attack, the bomber's gunners had acquired me and their fire was accurate. I broke off without pressing the attack." Those 2 seconds of confusion had been exactly what Sullivan predicted. Another Japanese pilot, Flight Petty Officer Hiroshi Nakamura, provided even more detailed analysis. "The markings created doubt at the moment when certainty was most critical," Nakamura explained. "We were trained to identify aircraft instantly, to know within a fraction of a second whether we faced friend or enemy. When that instant identification became impossible, when we needed additional time to confirm what we were seeing, the entire rhythm of our attack was disrupted. We would approach with confidence, then hesitate, then need to circle and re-engage. In that time, the bombers could take evasive action, their gunners could prepare, escort fighters could intervene. The Americans understood something profound about aerial combat. They understood that time was the most precious resource, and anything that bought them additional seconds bought them survival." These testimonies from enemy pilots validated everything Sullivan had theorized. The marking program worked not by completely fooling enemy pilots, but by introducing doubt at critical moments. That doubt translated into hesitation, hesitation translated into time, and time translated into survival. The mathematical elegance of the concept became apparent through statistical analysis conducted by operations research specialists after the war. Combat engagement timelines were measured in seconds. The average Japanese fighter attack run lasted approximately 15 to 20 seconds from initial approach to breaking off. Gunners needed approximately 3 to 5 seconds to acquire and track a target effectively. Fighter escorts needed approximately 10 to 15 seconds to respond to an attack on bombers they were protecting. 2 seconds of enemy hesitation at the beginning of an attack run meant that gunners had those additional 2 seconds to prepare their response. It meant that escort fighters had 2 additional seconds to react. It meant that evasive maneuvers could be initiated 2 seconds earlier. In the complex calculus of aerial combat, those 2 seconds created cascading advantages that significantly improved survival probability. Operations research teams calculated that a 2-second delay in enemy attack commitment improved bomber survival probability by approximately 18 to 22%, depending on specific tactical circumstances. That figure aligned closely with the observed reduction in loss rates among marked aircraft. The marking program had achieved almost exactly the tactical advantage that mathematical analysis predicted it should achieve. The innovation's success also highlighted the importance of leadership willing to consider unconventional ideas. Sullivan's proposal had been rejected twice before finding a commander willing to authorize even a limited trial. The concept seemed too simple, too strange, too likely to create more problems than it solved. But someone in the chain of command had been willing to suspend judgment and allow the theory to be tested under controlled conditions. That willingness to experiment, to try unconventional approaches, to test ideas that seemed initially implausible, proved essential to the innovation's success. Military organizations, by nature conservative and resistant to change, must balance that conservatism with openness to innovation. The marking program demonstrated how significant tactical advantages could emerge from unlikely sources when organizations remained open to testing new concepts. The program also revealed the importance of rapid feedback and adaptation. Sullivan and his teams continuously refined marking patterns based on combat results. They analyzed which configurations produced the most effective visual confusion. They adjusted designs as Japanese pilots adapted to the deception. They integrated feedback from crews, intelligence specialists, and operations analysts to continuously improve effectiveness. This iterative process of testing, analyzing, and refining proved as important as the initial concept. Innovation without adaptation produces temporary advantages that enemies quickly counter. Innovation, combined with continuous refinement, produces sustained advantages that remain effective even as enemies develop countermeasures. By early August 1945, as the war approached its conclusion, the marked bombers of Sullivan's squadron and other units employing the technique had compiled a combat record that exceeded even the most optimistic projections. From March through August, these aircraft had flown more than 200 combat missions with loss rates substantially below fleet averages. Individual squadrons had gone 40, 50, even 60 consecutive missions without losing a single aircraft to enemy fighter action. The numbers spoke for themselves, but the human impact spoke even more powerfully. Technical Sergeant James Kowalski, a flight engineer on a marked B-24, survived the war and returned to Detroit, where he worked in an automotive plant for 37 years. In a 1983 interview for a local historical society, Kowalski reflected on the marking program's significance. "We knew the odds," he said. "We knew that every mission could be our last. But when they painted those markings on our plane, when Captain Sullivan explained how it worked and why it might save our lives, something changed. We felt like we had a chance. Not a guarantee, but a chance. That's all any of us wanted, just a fighting chance to make it home. I flew 31 missions on that marked aircraft. I saw fighters come at us and pull away. I saw the confusion in their attack patterns. I made it home because of those markings. I got to see my family again, got to have a life, got to have children and grandchildren, all because somebody was willing to try something that seemed crazy but turned out to work." Kowalski's testimony captured the essential humanity underlying the tactical innovation. Behind the statistics and analysis were individual human beings whose lives were saved by those moments of enemy hesitation. Young men who returned home instead of dying in burning aircraft over the Pacific. Families who remained whole instead of receiving telegrams informing them of losses. Futures that unfolded instead of ending in flames at 22 or 23 years old. The marking program's legacy extended into post-war military doctrine and training. The concept of exploiting enemy visual recognition patterns influenced aircraft design and tactical planning in subsequent conflicts. During the Korean War, some United Nations aircraft employed modified markings designed to create confusion among enemy pilots. During the Vietnam War, American aircraft sometimes used non-standard camouflage patterns that exploited enemy identification procedures. The fundamental principle that Sullivan had discovered, that understanding enemy perception and deliberately manipulating visual cues could produce tactical advantages, became integrated into broader military thinking about deception and psychological operations. But perhaps the program's most significant legacy was simpler and more profound. It demonstrated that individual initiative and creative thinking could save lives even within the rigid hierarchies and conservative doctrines of military organizations. Sullivan had not been a senior officer or a tactical genius. He had been a captain who survived a combat mission, asked questions about why he survived, and developed a theory based on careful observation and analysis. His willingness to pursue that theory, despite initial rejections, his persistence in developing the concept into a workable proposal, his methodical approach to testing and refining the innovation, all of these elements combined to create a program that saved dozens of aircraft and hundreds of lives. The story also revealed the importance of remaining open to learning even from desperate circumstances. The marking program emerged from desperation, from the grinding attrition of the Pacific Air War's final year, when bomber crews faced increasingly fanatical opposition. But rather than simply accepting casualties as inevitable, Sullivan had looked for patterns, asked questions, and developed solutions. That refusal to accept the status quo, that determination to find better approaches even in the darkest circumstances, represented the spirit that ultimately won the war. American forces at every level, from individual crew members to senior commanders, demonstrated a willingness to innovate, adapt, and experiment that gave them crucial advantages over enemies who often proved more rigid in their thinking. The marked bombers flew their final combat missions in early August 1945. On August 6, marked B-24s from Sullivan's squadron participated in conventional bombing raids against Japanese positions, while a single B-29 named Enola Gay flew a very different mission over Hiroshima. 3 days later, on August 9th, as another B-29 dropped an atomic bomb on Nagasaki, marked bombers continued their missions against tactical targets. On August 15th, when Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, marked aircraft were being prepared for missions that would never be flown. The war ended with Sullivan's squadron and other units employing the marking technique, having compiled combat records that stood among the most impressive of any bomber units in the Pacific theater. The final statistics were calculated in the months following the war's conclusion. Aircraft flying with modified markings had completed 207 combat missions between March 19th and August 15th, 1945. During this period, marked aircraft sustained 32% less combat damage than unmarked aircraft in comparable tactical situations. Loss rates among marked aircraft were 41% lower than unmarked aircraft facing similar opposition. Crew survival rates among marked aircraft exceeded fleet averages by 37%. These numbers translated into specific human outcomes. An estimated 43 aircraft were saved from destruction by the protection the markings provided. Approximately 300 American airmen survived the war, who statistically would have been expected to die based on fleet average loss rates. Those 300 men returned home to families, to futures, to lives that extended decades beyond the war. They had children who would not have been born, pursued careers that would not have been pursued, contributed to their communities in ways that would not have been possible. The ripple effects of their survival extended far beyond the immediate military context. Captain Robert Sullivan, the officer who had conceived the marking program and fought for its implementation, completed the war with 37 combat missions to his credit. He received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his role in developing the marking program and the Legion of Merit for his contributions to aerial combat doctrine. After the war, Sullivan remained in the Air Force, serving in various capacities through the Korean War before retiring as a colonel in 1958. He spent his remaining years in California, where he worked as a consultant for aerospace companies and occasionally lectured at military institutions about tactical innovation and the importance of questioning assumptions. Sullivan rarely spoke publicly about the marking program, preferring to let the results speak for themselves. But in a 1976 letter to a military historian researching Pacific air operations, Sullivan offered his own assessment of what the program had achieved. "We did not win the war with paint," Sullivan wrote. "We won the war with industrial capacity, with courage, with the determination of millions of Americans who contributed in countless ways. But what we did with those markings was demonstrate that even in the final year of a brutal war, there was still room for innovation and creative thinking. We saved some lives. We gave some crews a better chance of making it home. That was enough. That was more than enough." The marking program stood as evidence that war, for all its destruction and tragedy, also produced moments of creative brilliance, born from the desperate need to protect human life. The thousands of hours that Sullivan and his teams spent analyzing combat reports, studying enemy tactics, designing marking patterns, and refining implementation procedures, all of that effort ultimately served one simple purpose: to give American airmen a better chance of surviving their missions and returning home. The mathematical elegance of the solution, the sophisticated understanding of visual perception and enemy training methods, the careful execution and continuous refinement, all of these elements combined to create an innovation that saved lives through nothing more complex than carefully applied paint. The marked bombers themselves mostly disappeared in the years following the war. Aircraft were scrapped or stored, their distinctive markings painted over or worn away by time and weather. A few examples survived in museums, their markings carefully preserved as evidence of an unusual chapter in aerial warfare history. Photographs remained, showing B-24s with their modified markings lined up on Pacific airfields or flying in formation over tropical seas. These images captured a moment when American ingenuity found a new way to protect its warriors, when careful observation and creative thinking combined to produce a tactical advantage that saved hundreds of lives. The men who flew those marked bombers scattered across America after the war, returning to the lives they had left behind or building new lives shaped by their experiences. They became teachers and factory workers, businessmen and farmers, continuing their lives with the knowledge that they had survived partly because of markings that exploited enemy recognition patterns for just a few critical seconds. Most never spoke extensively about their wartime experiences. They raised families, pursued careers, grew old carrying memories of missions flown and friends lost. But they knew, and their families knew, that creative thinking and careful innovation had given them something precious beyond measure, additional years of life that statistics suggested they should not have had. In the end, the story of the marked bombers revealed a truth that extended far and beyond military tactics or aerial combat doctrine. It revealed that human ingenuity, even in the midst of history's most destructive conflict, could find ways to preserve life and protect those who served. The marking program saved no cities, won no decisive battles, changed no strategic outcomes, but it brought hundreds of men home to their families. It gave them futures that extended decades beyond 1945. It demonstrated that even in war's darkest hours, creative thinking dedicated to protecting human life could make a measurable difference. That legacy endured long after the marked bombers themselves had vanished, long after the men who flew them had passed into history, a testament to what could be achieved when innovation served the cause of preserving life rather than taking it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.